Wyoming wind didn't just howl, it screamed like a dying animal. Through the blinding white of an 1883 blizzard, Ronald Caldwell saw a splash of impossible color, a freezing woman clutching a velvet satchel. She was meant to be a bride. Instead, she was nearly a frozen corpse. The winter of 1883 hit the Wyoming Territory with a malice that locals would speak of in hushed tones for decades. It wasn't just snow. It was a white blindness that swallowed cattle whole and froze men solid in their saddles. Ronald Caldwell was out in the thick of it, relying entirely on the instincts of his massive roan gelding, Buster, to navigate the featureless drift between the outpost town of Cheyenne and his solitary cabin on Miller's Ridge. Ronald was a man carved from the landscape he inhabited, hard, weathered, and deeply scarred by betrayals he left behind in Texas. He rode with his collar pulled high, the icy air burning his lungs with every breath. He was pushing 35, though the deep lines around his eyes suggested a man much older. He wanted nothing more than the isolation of his hearth, a stiff pour of rye whiskey, and the quiet crackle of burning pine. But the West rarely gives a man what he wants. Buster stopped short, letting out a nervous whinny that was instantly snatched away by the gale. Ronald spurred him gently, but the horse refused to move, stamping a heavy hoof into a towering snowdrift. Ronald dismounted, sinking past his knees into the powder. He drew his Winchester, squinting through the furious flurry. There was a shape half buried in the snow, not a felled pine and not a stray calf. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight, desperate ball beneath the meager shelter of an overturned buckboard wagon. Her lips were the color of bruised plums, her eyelashes heavy with ice. She wore a wool coat that was far too thin for the Wyoming winter, and beneath it, the unmistakable, tragic hem of a blue silk dress. Her ungloved hands were clamped fiercely around a ruined velvet satchel. Ronald dropped to his knees, ripping off his thick bearskin gloves. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. The pulse was there, but it was a frail, fluttering thing, like a trapped moth. "God Almighty," Ronald muttered, his voice instantly swallowed by the wind. He didn't waste time trying to wake her. He knew the stages of freezing. She was deep into the lethargy that immediately preceded death. Ronald unclasped his heavy buffalo hide duster and wrapped it around her frail frame, lifting her effortlessly against his chest. She weighed no more than a child. The ride back to the cabin was a blur of survival instinct. Ronald tied her to his own waist with a length of hemp rope to keep her from slipping off the saddle, walking ahead of the horse and breaking the trail with his own frozen legs. When they finally breached the tree line and the dark shape of his cabin emerged, Ronald kicked the heavy oak door open, dragging them both inside. He moved with frantic precision. He stoked the dying embers in the stone hearth until a roaring fire pushed back the bitter cold. He laid her on the thick rug before the fire, unwrapping the buffalo coat. Her blue dress was soaked through, stiff with ice. Propriety had no place in survival. He worked quickly, removing her frozen boots, the wet wool stockings, and the stiffened dress, wrapping her naked, shivering form in 3 heavy woolen blankets and a quilt. It was then he noticed the satchel she had gripped so fiercely. It had fallen open. Inside was an iron lockbox, its hinges violently pried apart and utterly empty. Beside it lay a crumpled, water-stained piece of parchment. Ronald unfolded it near the firelight. It was a letter of correspondence dated a month prior. "My dearest Rachel, your passage from Ohio is secured. The station master at Oak Haven will have a wagon waiting to bring you to the ranch. Bring the drafts, as we discussed, and we shall be wed by the circuit judge on the morrow. I eagerly await the arrival of my beautiful bride. Forever yours, Josiah Pendleton. Ronald felt the blood freeze in his veins, colder than the blizzard outside. Josiah Pendleton, the wealthiest cattle baron in the Laramie Valley, the man whose ruthless ambition had cost Ronald his land, his reputation, and nearly his neck at the end of a vigilante's rope 3 years ago. He looked down at the pale, shivering woman on his floor. Rachel. She wasn't just a lost traveler. She was Pendleton's mail-order bride, and she had been left to die. Rachel Higgins woke to the smell of wood smoke and chicory coffee. For a terrifying moment, her mind was entirely blank. Then, the memories rushed in like a physical blow. The brutal wind, the masked riders stopping the buckboard, the agonizing crack of the driver's skull as he was pistol-whipped into the snow. She remembered running, her lungs searing, the ice tearing at her skirts until her legs simply gave out. She gasped, sitting bolt upright. The sudden movement sent a wave of dizzying nausea through her, and she clutched the heavy wool blankets to her chest. She was in a small, rough-hewn log cabin. Rifles hung on the walls alongside dried herbs and traps. "Drink this. Slow." Rachel flinched. A man stepped from the shadows near the stove. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, untamed hair and a beard that framed a harsh, unyielding face. His eyes, however, held a steady, quiet calm. He handed her a tin cup of steaming broth. "Where am I?" Rachel's voice was a ragged whisper. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. "About 10 miles off the Oak Haven Trail," Ronald said, stepping back to give her space. "I found you under a wrecked wagon. You've been burning with fever for 2 days. Name's Ronald Caldwell." Rachel took a trembling sip of the broth. The warmth was agonizingly good. I am Rachel Higgins." She looked around frantically. "My satchel. Did you find a blue velvet satchel?" "I did," Ronald said. He walked to the heavy pine table and retrieved it, tossing it gently onto the foot of the bed. Lockbox inside was busted wide open. Empty. I reckon whoever ambushed your wagon wasn't just looking for loose change. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders slumping in relief. She closed her eyes. They took the box. Thank God. Ronald frowned, crossing his arms over his chest. "Most folks don't thank the Lord for getting robbed, Miss Higgins, especially when they're left to freeze to death on Josiah Pendleton's orders." Rachel's eyes snapped open, wide with shock. "Josiah's orders? No, you're mistaken. Josiah is my fiancé. He sent a wagon for me. We were ambushed by road agents." "Road agents don't operate in a Laramie blizzard, Rachel," Ronald interrupted, his voice low and firm. "They'd freeze before they found a mark. The only men riding in that weather are men following direct orders. And the only man with the money and the meanness to order men into a whiteout is Josiah Pendleton." Rachel stared at him, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the blankets. "Why would he do that?" "I have nothing. My father died in Ohio, ruined by debts. I answered Josiah's advertisement in the Cincinnati Enquirer. He promised me a home, security." "And what did you bring him in return?" Ronald asked softly. "A man like Pendleton doesn't want a penniless bride from Ohio. He doesn't do anything unless it fattens his pockets or expands his land." Rachel looked down at her lap, her breathing shallow. She had survived an abusive, debt-ridden father. She had survived the agonizing train ride west. She had survived the freezing snow. She was done playing the naive, obedient girl. "My father didn't die completely penniless," Rachel said, her voice hardening with newfound resolve. He had hidden $5,000 in bearer bonds, money he embezzled from the bank that ruined him. It was blood money. Josiah found out. He wrote to me, told me to bring the bonds. He said we could start fresh, invest it in the ranch, wash it clean. Ronald nodded grimly. So he sends his ranch hands to intercept the wagon. They kill the driver, take the lockbox with the bonds, and leave you to the elements. He gets the money, avoids marrying a fugitive's daughter, and the spring thaw hides the evidence. Except, Rachel said, a slow, humorless smile touching her bruised lips, they didn't get the bonds. Ronald raised an eyebrow. I saw the lockbox. It was empty. Of course it was empty. I filled it with iron horseshoes and old newspapers before I left Ohio, Rachel said. With trembling hands, she reached for the ruined blue silk dress folded on a nearby chair. She turned the bodice inside out, revealing thick, clumsy stitching along the corset lining. The bonds are sewn into the boning of my dress. If Josiah wanted my money, he was going to have to look me in the eye and marry me to get it. Ronald stared at the woman. Beneath the fragile, frost-bitten exterior was a mind as sharp as a skinning knife. A quiet, deep respect bloomed in his chest. "Well, Miss Higgins," Ronald murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, "you're a whole lot more dangerous than you look." "Mr. Caldwell," Rachel replied, her gaze meeting his with unflinching intensity. "If what you say about Josiah is true, when the storm breaks he will realize he was robbed of horseshoes, and he will come looking for my body to find the rest." Ronald turned toward the frosted window, looking out at the howling white wall of the storm. Pendleton had taken his ranch. He wasn't going to let him take this woman's life. "Let him come," Ronald said quietly, dropping his hand to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "I've been waiting for Josiah Pendleton to cross my path for 3 long years. In the end, the West breaks those who refuse to bend, but it forged Rachel and Ronald into something unbreakable. They didn't build their life on stolen gold or broken promises, but on the quiet truth found in a blizzard. The storm had stripped away their pasts, leaving only the fierce, enduring love of 2 survivors who walked into the cold alone and walked out together. For 4 days, the Laramie blizzard trapped them in a breathless white purgatory. Inside the cabin, however, the brutal cold gave way to a quiet, cautious domesticity. The forced isolation stripped away the polite fiction society usually demanded of a man and a woman, leaving only raw honesty. Rachel recovered slowly. The terrifying blue hue of her skin faded to a pale porcelain, though her fingertips remained tender and her lungs rattled with a lingering cough. She spent the days wrapped in Ronald's oversized woolen shirts, watching him work. Ronald was a man of deliberate, economic movements. He chopped wood, cleaned his rifles, and cooked simple meals of salt pork and beans without wasting a single motion or word. Yet, beneath his stoic exterior, Rachel sensed a simmering violence, a coiled spring waiting to snap. On the 3rd evening, as the wind began to finally die down to a mournful hum, Rachel sat by the hearth, carefully picking apart the seams of her ruined silk dress with a small hunting knife. She extracted the bearer bonds, laying the crisp, water-stained certificates on the pine table. $5,000. It was a fortune that had cost her father his soul and nearly cost Rachel her life. Ronald watched her from across the room, polishing the cylinder of his Colt. "You burn those, you're truly penniless, Rachel." "They are already ashes as far as I'm concerned," she replied, her voice steady. She looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. You said you've been waiting for Josiah Pendleton for 3 years. Why?" Ronald paused. He set the rag down, his jaw tightening. He reached up, slowly unbuttoning the collar of his Henley shirt. Around his throat, thick, rope-burned scars wrapped like a grotesque necklace, pale and angry against his tanned skin. Rachel gasped softly, her hand instinctively rising to her mouth. "I had a spread down in the valley," Ronald said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. 100 head of cattle, good grazing grass, and a natural spring that never froze over. Pendleton wanted the water rights. When I wouldn't sell, my cattle started disappearing. Then a dead ranch hand of Pendleton's was found on my property, a bullet from my caliber of rifle in his back. Ronald looked away, staring into the flames. Pendleton owned the sheriff, owned the judge. They didn't even bother with a trial. A posse dragged me out of my bed in the dead of night, threw a rope over a cottonwood branch and pulled. They left me dancing on the air. "How did you survive?" Rachel asked, her heart breaking at the stark emptiness in his tone. "The branch was rotted. It snapped," Ronald said flatly. "I woke up in the dirt hours later, half frozen, my throat crushed. Took me a year to speak again. By then, Pendleton had my land, and Ronald Caldwell was listed as a dead outlaw in the county ledgers. I moved up to this ridge, trapping and hunting, waiting for the day Pendleton slipped up." He looked back at Rachel, his gaze piercing. "Then I found you in the snow." Rachel stood, crossing the small room. She didn't offer pity. She knew from her own father's ruin that pity was useless to a survivor. Instead, she reached out, her warm, calloused fingers gently tracing the edge of the scar on his neck. Ronald flinched slightly, not from pain, but from the unfamiliarity of a gentle touch. "He stole your life," Rachel whispered fiercely, "and he tried to steal mine." "The storm is breaking," Ronald noted, looking out the frosted window at the moonlight reflecting off the snow. "By tomorrow noon, the crust will be hard enough for horses. When Pendleton's men realize they stole a box full of horseshoes, they'll backtrack. This is the only shelter within 15 miles of where your wagon went down. They will come here." Ronald turned, retrieving a heavy, short-barreled Smith & Wesson Schofield revolver from a wooden crate. He broke the action, checking the chambers before handing it to Rachel. It was heavy, reeking of gun oil and cold iron. "I won't let them take you back, Rachel," Ronald said, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, protective vow. "But if I fall, you don't hesitate. You aim for the center of the chest and you pull the trigger until it clicks empty. Understand?" Rachel gripped the walnut handle of the revolver. The terrified, obedient girl from Ohio had died in the snowdrift. The woman, standing in her place, nodded, her eyes hard. "I understand." By midday, the brilliant Wyoming sun was blinding, reflecting off the pristine, deadly white landscape. The silence of the ridge was absolute, until the frantic, warning barks of Ronald's hounds shattered the peace. Ronald kicked dirt over the fire, plunging the cabin into smoky shadows. He cracked the heavy oak shutters, sliding the barrel of his Winchester through the gap. Rachel crouched behind the overturned oak table, the Schofield heavy in her sweating hands. Through the trees, the riders appeared. There were 5 of them, their horses struggling through the chest-high drifts. At the front rode a massive, bearded man in a heavy buffalo coat. Even from 100 yards away, Rachel recognized the arrogant, upright posture. It was Josiah Pendleton himself. "Caldwell!" Josiah Pendleton's voice boomed across the clearing, thick with false bravado. He reined in his black stallion 50 yards from the porch, his men fanning out in a semicircle, their repeaters resting across their saddles. "I know you're in there, Ronald," Josiah called out, a cruel smirk twisting his face. "My foreman told me the tracks led up to the Ghost's Ridge. I should have known a weed like you wouldn't die from a simple hanging." Inside the cabin, Ronald cocked the hammer of his Winchester. The metallic click was deafening in the quiet room. "You're trespassing on dead man's land, Josiah. Ride away or join me." Josiah laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "I don't care about you, Ronald. You can keep this miserable shack. I came for my bride, and I came for what belongs to me. Send the girl out with the bonds, and I'll let you go back to freezing in the mud. Keep her, and I'll burn you both down to the foundations." Rachel's breath hitched. She looked at the stack of bearer bonds resting on the floor beside her. It was so simple. Hand out the paper and they might live. But she remembered the cold. She remembered the driver's skull cracking. She remembered the scars on Ronald's neck. Giving in to Pendleton meant a lifetime of looking over their shoulders, forever hunted by a man who left no loose ends. "Don't answer him," Ronald whispered to Rachel, his eye glued to the rifle sights. He shifted his aim toward a scrawny rider trying to flank them through the pines. "Last chance, Caldwell," Josiah yelled, drawing his own pistol. "Go to hell, Pendleton," Ronald roared. Ronald fired. The Winchester roared, kicking back against his shoulder. The scrawny flanking rider screamed, tumbling backward out of his saddle into the deep snow, clutching a shattered collarbone. Chaos erupted. The remaining 4 men opened fire simultaneously. The sound was apocalyptic. Bullets tore through the thin pine walls of the cabin, sending jagged splinters of wood and hot lead flying through the air. The heavy cast-iron stove rang out like a bell as a slug ricocheted off it. Rachel covered her head, pressing herself flat against the floorboards as the air filled with the choking, sulphurous smoke of black powder. Ronald moved with terrifying speed. He pumped the lever of his rifle, firing through the shutter gap, taking down a second rider's horse to pin the man behind the heavy carcass. But there were too many guns. "Fire the roof," Josiah commanded from behind the safety of a massive granite boulder. "Burn the rats out." One of the men dismounted, striking a match to a kerosene-soaked rag wrapped around a heavy stick. He reared back to throw the torch onto the cabin's dry cedar shake roof. Ronald aimed, but a volley of suppressing fire forced him away from the window. A bullet grazed his upper arm, tearing through the wool shirt and drawing a sharp hiss of pain from his lips. He stumbled back, clutching his bleeding shoulder. The torch sailed through the air, landing with a heavy thud on the wooden front porch. The flames immediately caught the dry timber, licking hungrily at the front door. Smoke began to curl beneath the floorboards, filling the cabin with a thick, suffocating haze. "Ronald!" Rachel cried, crawling toward him. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat, desperately tying it around his bleeding arm. "We have to go out the back window," Ronald coughed, his eyes watering from the smoke. "Make a run for the tree line. I'll cover you." "No," Rachel said fiercely. "They'll shoot us like dogs in the snow. Josiah doesn't want us dead, Ronald. He wants this." She grabbed the stack of bearer bonds. Before Ronald could stop her, Rachel stood up. She kicked the front door open. The sudden rush of oxygen fed the porch fire, sending a wall of heat and flame rising between her and the riders. "Hold your fire! Hold fire!" Josiah screamed from behind the boulder, terrified a stray bullet would hit his prize. Rachel stood in the doorway, framed by smoke and fire, the Schofield revolver hanging forgotten in her left hand. In her right, she held the $5,000 in bearer bonds high in the air. "Rachel, my sweet, Josiah called out, stepping out from behind the rock, his eyes locked greedily on the paper in her hand. "Be reasonable now. Step away from the fire. Bring me the dowry and we can go home." "You wanted my dowry, Josiah?" Rachel yelled, her voice cutting through the crackle of the flames, laced with a venom she didn't know she possessed. "You wanted the blood money that killed my father? You wanted the price of my life? Rachel, don't be foolish. It's yours." With a swift, violent motion, Rachel threw the thick stack of bearer bonds directly into the roaring flames of the porch fire. The paper ignited instantly, curling and blackening as the fire consumed the fortune. For a second, there was absolute silence. Then, a sound tore from Josiah Pendleton's throat, an inhuman, guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated greed and agony. His mind, so obsessed with wealth and control, simply shattered at the sight of his fortune turning to ash. "No! No!" Josiah screamed, dropping his gun. Completely abandoning reason, cover, and survival instinct, he sprinted across the open snow directly toward the burning porch. He threw himself into the flames, his thick buffalo coat catching fire instantly as he clawed frantically at the burning paper, trying to salvage the ashes. His remaining men watched in horror. They were hired guns, paid to shoot, not to watch a madman burn himself alive over scraps of paper. Seeing their boss engulfed in flames and realizing the payday was literally up in smoke, the two remaining riders exchanged a panicked look, spurred their horses, and fled back down the trail, abandoning him. Josiah stumbled backward off the porch, a human torch screaming into the Wyoming sky. He thrashed blindly, falling into a deep, icy snowdrift. The snow violently hissed, extinguishing the flames, but it was too late. The shock of the severe burns, combined with the freezing snow and the utter collapse of his lungs, left him writhing weakly in the red-stained powder. Rachel stood in the doorway, staring down at the ruined, whimpering man who had tried to play God with her life. She felt no pity, only a profound, heavy emptiness. Ronald stepped up beside her, his Winchester hanging loosely at his side, his left arm bleeding heavily. He looked down at the dying cattle baron, then kicked a pile of snow onto the porch, stamping out the remaining flames on the wood. Josiah looked up at Ronald, his face blackened, his breathing shallow and ragged. My money," he wheezed. "It was never yours, Josiah," Ronald said quietly. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't need to. He simply turned his back on the man who had hanged him, took Rachel's trembling hand, and led her back inside the smoky, battered cabin. Outside, the wind began to howl again, and the Laramie winter claimed Josiah Pendleton, freezing him into the very land he had killed to own. Inside, Ronald barred the door. He leaned heavily against the wall, sliding down to the floorboards. Rachel dropped beside him, the adrenaline finally leaving her system. She buried her face in his chest, her hands gripping his shirt, and finally wept, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming, crushing weight of survival. Ronald wrapped his uninjured arm tightly around her, burying his face in her hair. The fortune was gone. The cabin was riddled with holes. The winter was far from over. But as he held the woman who had burned her past to save his future, Ronald Caldwell knew he was the richest man in the Wyoming Territory. The Wyoming winter takes more than it gives, but from the ashes of Pendleton's greed, Ronald and Rachel forged something unbreakable. They didn't build their future on stolen money or false promises, but on the quiet, enduring truth found in the heart of a blizzard. Stripped of their pasts, two solitary survivors walked into the bitter cold alone, only to walk out of the thawing snow together, finally home.